All right, it is the top of the hour, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining today's webinar, Drive Value with Information Architecture. We appreciate you joining us today. The first thing I'd like to do is take a quick moment and introduce our speakers. My name is Maya Woldridge, and I'm in business development here at Gimmal. Today, I'm joined by our key speaker, Gimmal Product Manager, Will Irwin. And before we get started, I've got a few housekeeping items to go through. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, feel free to go ahead and submit them in the Q&A section on your screen at any time, and we'll answer as many as we have time for at the end of the presentation. And as always, if you have any technical difficulties, please let us know so we can assist you. To kick things off, I'd like to take the next couple of slides to tell you a little bit about Gimmal and how we can help you take control of your information with our suite of solutions. Founded in 2002, Gimmal is a records, information management, and governance software company that helps you balance the value your information provides with the risk it also presents. Whether you're trying to discover information in unstructured data sources, migrate from legacy systems, or comply with policies across multiple repositories, Gimmal can help you achieve your information governance goals. We've got a client success team and global network of partners that deliver solutions in conjunction with key partners like Microsoft and SAP. Gimmal's family of software products work together to let you create an efficient digital workplace. Our comprehensive solutions include migration, file analysis, electronic and physical records management, and document management for SAP. Earlier this summer, Gimmal also announced the acquisition of Sherpa Software, adding full data governance and e-discovery capabilities to the Gimmal Discover product suite. But with that, I'd like to go ahead and hand it over to you, Will.
Yeah, hello, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Maya, and thanks to everybody for joining the webinar. My name is Will Irwin. I'm a product manager at Gimmal, and I'm excited to talk about the value of information architecture today. Before I moved over to product management, I used to provide consulting services at Gimmal, so I know a little bit about the importance of having good information architecture and how it leads into an organization's overall governance plan. I do make a lot of references to Microsoft SharePoint today, but these general strategies can really apply to most any ECM platform that you might be using. All right, so what is information architecture? How does Gimmal define this? Information architecture is really the framework that defines site topologies, or your high-level containers, metadata, taxonomy, and the more SharePoint-specific content types or groupings of metadata and attributes, which enable the effective implementation of content governance rules and support for the end user by improving the experience of finding and using that information. So really what we're saying here is it's pretty much about organizing things effectively. Information architecture really helps you organize all the important information in your company, in your organization, so you can more easily store it, find it, use it, and control that information. And this is a very concise statement. The four highlighted words at the bottom here will kind of form a kind of a common thread when discussing the building blocks of good information architecture. Storing, finding, and using information really are generally of more interest to the end users who are working with, collaborating, and creating this content on a daily basis. And controlling and managing that information is usually more of interest to administrators of the platform or managers of a certain department or business process. And the importance of information architecture, just to go a little bit deeper with these concepts. Foundation, usability, manageability. We might think of these as our three pillars of good information architecture. First, we start with the foundation. Information architecture plays a role at the very core of the system and helping to determine how the content will be organized for storage. Not necessarily the back end IT infrastructure looks like, but rather the structure of the content storage containers within your ECM solution like SharePoint. Along with that, we have usability. The system should flow properly. It should be intuitive and make sense to the end users because they're the primary people working with the content, and they need to know where to create and save content and how to find that information again later. From a management perspective, not only the IT system administrators, but also corporate executives and managers really rely on the detailed reporting they can get from the system and auditing processes that ensure overall, their overall compliance and governance goals are being met. And with a solid information architecture, the information people need can be more easily extracted for their use. And now we're going to take a look at the building blocks we use when designing the information architecture for a system. And again, some of the examples I cover today will be a little SharePoint specific, but these include site topology, metadata, taxonomy, and content types. And first, we'll be taking a look at the site topology. This really helps define the content repository container structure. And SharePoint specific containers really from the bottom up consist of your folders, your document libraries and lists, sites and site collections. And whenever I say site collections, you can think of the default team site that you can create in SharePoint. And some of the uses of the topology are to separate content, usually based on distinct work or business processes, so that we can apply things like maybe different security on groups of content or apply different retention settings depending on the container, as well as just having an area for a team or a department to collaborate and share their content. And the topology may be completely hidden from the end user depending on the navigation structure of the site design. Properly implemented navigation and properly implemented search delivers a consistent user experience no matter where the end user is currently located in the site hierarchy. So, users starting from maybe the top level portal site collection can logically navigate down to the other site collections, so that maybe navigationally it can appear to the users that they're drilling down deeper into the site topology. But technically, however, all of the site collections may live on the same level, creating a very flat, very horizontal site structure. And really, this approach makes it easier to govern and manage. And because of this, in our SharePoint specific example here, I know I have them listed here, but we highly recommend avoiding subsites altogether if possible. Subsites aren't very flexible and are very resistant to change. And if you must use these, then we recommend creating them only for temporary purposes. Don't try and make these subsites permanent in your intranet structure. And instead, we suggest utilizing the relatively new, I know they've been out for a while, but the relatively new hub sites diagrammed over here on the right-hand side to kind of logically group and connect your team sites together. These hub sites are much more flexible and allow for better organic growth over time, especially when and really if and when you need to reorganize your departments or your teams. Our next information architecture building block is metadata. This is data about data, meaning that metadata is just data that describes other data. a common example that we like to use is that metadata is the label on the can of soup that tells you what's inside. It lists everything clearly with terms and words that most people, most users are going to be familiar with. One of the things we must do and think about when creating our label is to determine what's really necessary to include there. Some of the questions we should ask ourselves when designing good information architecture are, will this metadata attribute or property help users find what they're looking for easier? Does this help the end user, the content creator, right? Another question is it necessary to support an important process, such as records management, classification, or retention, or maybe to support some special workflow requirements? Metadata, in my opinion, this is probably the most critical component of information architecture, and it's directly linked to our next building block here. Which is taxonomy. So taxonomy is the enterprise metadata model. It's the tree you use to classify all of your different kinds of content, your documents and files. Taxonomy takes the metadata and then organizes it into a logical model. And we find that sometimes we need more than one taxonomy to help classify this content. For example, maybe finance looks at their content in a certain way. The legal team may need something different, and the records manager has yet another way of viewing this content, and yet they're still all looking at the same documents. In our example here, we'll follow the Dalmatian. So in the first taxonomy, the biological taxonomy, we've got the Dalmatian has been categorized as a canine. In our second taxonomy here, one that's based on appearance, we've got the Dalmatians classified as having spots. And finally, in our third taxonomy based on habitat, the Dalmatian falls under the classification of domestic. So here we can have one object, the Dalmatian, classified in 3 different ways. And we can use metadata for building taxonomies to provide and maintain a kind of a common language across the system so that each group who may create or work with or reference this content can find what they're looking for. And the fourth building block is content types, sometimes called object types in other systems. So content types are groups of reusable settings that describe shared metadata and behaviors. So taking a little bit closer look at that, content types are groups of settings or metadata attributes that define characteristics and behaviors for a certain piece of content. Really, in determining when to define and create a content type, some of our considerations are, what metadata groupings are needed for searching, filtering, or viewing this content. How will retention and compliance be related to content types and metadata? Are there any application specific templates that we can attach to a content type? Are there any other special processing needs? The example below here shows a potential content type hierarchy. The way this can be structured is highly dependent on organizational policies and procedures. But with this kind of structure shown here, the company can maintain control from the top to ensure that any compliance requirements are met if they have those kind of policies. But at the same time, in this example, the departments are free to create content types specific to their own needs. Again, this hybrid approach to governing content types, it might not work for all organizations, and usually we recommend a more stricter control when defining a corporate taxonomy, but that all depends on the organization. And to summarize, these four components are the core building blocks to create a solid information architecture foundation. Properly utilizing and implementing these components, again, it helps an organization store, find, use, and control that information a bit easier. And now after going through all the building blocks, we're going to circle back and take a look at the value brought to an organization through the use of information architecture components that we've been talking about. And not everything is listed here. Really, this is just kind of the end user benefits right now, but I'll speak to a few other benefits too. Starting with the first row in the table, we can standardize taxonomies and term lists, providing a common language so that everybody knows what things are called and they understand their purposes. With content types, we can define content classifications and help keep user input to a minimum. That's always important. The users will have a standard set of documents they can create, and others will be able to find more easily what they're looking for. It's really hard to do your job if you can't find your work material. And carefully naming our sites and containers with commonly used and understood terms can help users know where to go in order to find what they're looking for. Common terminology will also make keyword searching for documents a bit easier. And our site topology can be built from a taxonomy based on business processes. So people doing the same type of work will all be able to work in the same place and find the majority of what they need to accomplish their tasks. And with our standardized and managed term lists, users will have a common language for searching, finding the documents created by other people too, if they need to reference it from other teams. And really the value of information architecture, it's not only just about making it easier on the end user, right? I mean, that's that's a huge benefit. That's what we want. We want it to be easy on the end user, but it's also about staying in compliance and also saving an organization time and money. Information and content sprawl, it's a real thing, and good information architecture can help mitigate and solve these kinds of problems. So once the information architecture it's defined and in place, it's important to then surround that framework with governance and records management policies. We have several products that tie directly into this. I'll just name a few of them. So Gimmal drop zones, they can assist with governance issues by assisting and making it easier for users to upload and tag metadata to net new content in SharePoint Online specifically. And we also have Gimmal Records Management that can help organizations stay in compliance by applying the appropriate classification and retention policies. And again, all of this is driven by having a solid information architecture foundation, and it's key and really the first step to applying and maintaining that overall governance. And I think that's all I had for today's session. It was pretty short and sweet. I think I covered most of everything I wanted to talk about today, but do we have any questions from the group?
Yeah, we've reached the Q&A portion of our presentation at this point, and I think we've got a few questions. The first one says, most of our information is located in nested folders rather than this approach. What are your recommendations on moving to good information architecture as you described?
Get them out of the folders. Yeah, we definitely don't recommend using folders. I know it's kind of hard not to, right? Especially when creating a taxonomy, it takes time. It takes some effort, it takes some thought to go into it. And whenever you're in your day-to-day work and business processes, you don't always have the time to really think about that. You need to get something in there. Sometimes it's the easiest way just to create a folder really quick and throw your documents into it. But really, that's the worst approach you can take. Highly recommend getting out of folders if you can. definitely recommend the approach of content types and metadata. And really, you don't need a whole lot of metadata either. We recommend trying to limit this to about maybe 6 metadata fields that require any kind of user input, because really the more metadata you ask from your users, the less inclined they're going to be to fill that information in. So yeah, definitely recommend the content type metadata approach. And really the cool way to kind of emulate a folder structure, or if you still like to have that kind of folder structure visualization, is to create certain views within your SharePoint library itself, which kind of act as kind of a way to view your folders. So you can actually create these things called group by views that can take certain metadata elements that you've created within your taxonomy and group your content by that. So it kind of emulates the folder concept without it being real folders, and again, it's much more powerful in that approach.
All right, great. The next question, how realistic is it to have what you call good information architecture across the different places information is stored in our organization? Not everyone uses SharePoint.
Yeah, no, it's realistic. You can get there. It definitely takes some thought and some effort to go behind it. It doesn't just happen overnight. Just because everything's not in SharePoint doesn't mean you can't have good information architecture also. We definitely recommend, if you can, utilize SharePoint to its full extent, but we know that there's still people out there using a bunch of file shares and stuff like that. It's always good to discover what you have and then apply the right classification and retention to that information so that at least you're managing it effectively.
All right. The next question I have is, how do you determine or write information architecture? We are undergoing a migration and would be helpful to have a baseline.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's all about before that migration happens, you want to know what you're migrating it into, right? I would always recommend before actually just taking what you got and plopping it into whatever repository you're moving into, plan it out accordingly, figure out what you've got. Sometimes it does take, and usually it always takes, some kind of at least a minimum workshopping effort with the end users who are creating, collaborating, and using this content, so that they can tell you what's there, how they use it, how they categorize it, how they work with it, so that you can better plan for information architecture in your new repository. Because you don't want to just migrate all your information over, plop it down, and then have be in the same exact situation where you're moving from. So sometimes some of those workshop meetings are necessary, but really it's key for providing better IA in your new area.
All right. Next question. Why can't I just leverage AI tools to find and use information?
You definitely can, but that sometimes only gets you half the way there. I know metadata and content types, especially in the SharePoint platform, they're not going away. Microsoft still heavily relies on this stuff, and even with some of the cool, artificial intelligence and machine learning capabilities that are being developed right now, it's still pretty heavily reliant on that metadata and that taxonomy structure being there and the proper values being applied to that taxonomy. So you can't just ignore it forever. You need some kind of minimum baseline to be present for you to truly get the experience that you're looking for.
All right. I've got a couple more questions here. We have a lot of information located in file shares. Is that an issue with this approach?
We recommend moving out of file shares if you can. There are products and solutions that are available to help you manage that file share content a bit easier. But really, we recommend getting it out of there, moving it into a true ECM solution if you can. Again, it's not the worst thing in the world. Sometimes whenever people are going through a migration initiative, sometimes we like to take a look at, okay, what content are you using today? What's relevant today? If there's anything that, maybe you have a bunch of content that might be old and stale, sometimes it's best to just, if you don't need it right away, leave it there. Maybe have, another system look at that content, identify it and manage it effectively. But if it's not being used day to day, then don't bring it over. But all of that takes some, a little bit of time, a little bit of workshop, a little bit of effort to identify what you got.
All right. Another question I've got. One slide you mentioned ways that good information architecture can help users. How might information architecture bring value in terms of the business?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. The
Oh, well,
sorry, one second, sorry.
No problem.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not just a value to the end user. Sure, that is a huge value add, but it's also a value to the organization. Um, an organization needs to be able to know what they have, so that they can stay in compliance, and so that's not a risk for the future, right? And also, like I was mentioning earlier, if you don't know what you have and where it is and what it is, you could easily have content sprawl happen on you, to where that costs a lot of time and money to rectify that issue, and it could also bloat your search results and stuff like that, and which will also affect the end user and the organization as a whole. So it's better to get a handle on that as soon as you can.
All right. Well, if you have any additional questions, feel free to reference our contact information that's been there on the screen. You can also send us an email at info@gimmal.com or visit our website at www.gimmal.com. And for those interested in a recording of this webinar, we will be sending it out between 24 to 48 hours in the form of a thank you email. We also hope to see you for our webinar next week, The Ugly Truth About Records Management Tools. With that, thank you everyone for joining us.